Imagine being betrayed by the people you love the most, sold into slavery, humiliated, thrown into prison for a crime you didn't commit, and yet, rising to become the most powerful man in a nation. This is the story of Joseph, a young man with big dreams who was literally thrown into a pit before his life took an unimaginable turn. But what if I told you that every tragedy he faced was part of a greater plan? That the pain, the losses, and even the injustices were shaping his destiny? This story isn't just about Joseph, it's about how God can turn the worst moment of your life into the beginning of your greatest victory. So stay until the end, because what you're about to discover might just change the way you see your own challenges. The wind blew gently over the lands of Canaan, swaying the leaves of the trees and spreading the aroma of the pasture fields. Jacob, a man of many years and many experiences, looked proudly at his sons, but it was in Joseph, his 17-year-old son, that his heart found a special gleam. Joseph was not just a son, he was the son of Jacob's old age, a gift that carried the memory of his beloved wife Rachel. Since he was young, Joseph showed something different. He was more attentive, more just, and his heart seemed always to seek the truth. This did not always please his brothers, who often saw him as a spoiled boy, favored by their father. The relationship between Joseph and his brothers was tense, and everything worsened when Jacob decided to gift him with a colorful tunic, a symbol of favoritism that made envy grow even more in the hearts of the other sons. One night, Joseph had a dream that would change the course of his life forever. He got up the next morning, his eyes shining with excitement, and without hesitation, ran to his brothers who were tending to the flocks. "Brothers, I need to tell you about a dream I had," he said enthusiastically. His brothers, already used to Joseph's talkative nature, stopped for a moment, crossed their arms, and waited. "In my dream, we were in the field tying bundles of wheat. Suddenly, my bundle stood upright, and yours bowed down around it." Joseph told them, unaware of the storm his words were about to cause. The brothers looked at each other, and their expressions changed from interest to disdain. "So, you're saying that you will rule over us?" one of them mocked, while another shook his head in disbelief. "You, our Lord? Never." Sarcastic laughter spread among them, but deep inside their hearts, a darker feeling grew: envy. Joseph, in his innocence, didn't realize that his words had added fuel to a fire that was already burning. But what seemed bad grew even worse. Days later, Joseph had another dream, and once again, with the same excitement, he decided to share it with his family. "I dreamed that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down before me," he announced, unaware of the impact his words would have. This time, even Jacob, his father, was troubled. "What does this mean, Joseph? That I, your mother, and your brothers will bow down before you?" Jacob asked, furrowing his brow. Joseph lowered his head. He didn't know how to explain it, he only felt that these dreams came from God. But whereas before his brothers merely mocked him, now their disdain turned into rage. Hatred burned inside them, and Joseph became not just an irritating brother but an enemy. The days passed, but the brothers' envy only grew. What had once been just an annoyance transformed into a dark desire to rid themselves of him. Joseph, however, continued his life, unaware that the future would take him far from his home, down a path of pain, loss, and a great turn that only God could bring about. And so, the young dreamer went about his routine, unaware that fate was already beginning to chart his course, and that his story was just beginning. After being sold as a slave by his own brothers, Joseph, the young son of Jacob, found himself in a completely new and unfamiliar place. He was taken to Egypt, a distant land full of mysteries, where everything was different from what he knew in his homeland. But even in the face of such pain and suffering, something inside him refused to break. The Bible shows us that, although he was in a difficult situation, God was with him. This means that, even in the hardest circumstances, Joseph was not alone. Joseph was bought by Potiphar, an important official of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was a man of great authority, a commander of Pharaoh's guard, which meant that he had many servants and slaves under his command. The place where Joseph was taken was no easy one, but the Bible tells us something incredible: the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. Genesis 39 verse 2. Joseph, even as a slave, began to show his intelligence and skills in surprising ways. He did not allow the hardships of life to define him. On the contrary, he used his talents to stand out. Joseph did not just fulfill his tasks, he went above and beyond. He was diligent, honest, and highly competent in what he did. This caught Potiphar's attention. Soon, Joseph was put in charge of everything in his master's household. Potiphar noticed that everything Joseph touched prospered, that his house became more organized, and that business was going very well when Joseph was in charge. Joseph earned Potiphar's trust to such an extent that he no longer worried about anything, except for the food he ate. Genesis 39 verse 6. But what really stands out in this part of the story is Joseph's faithfulness. He not only dedicated himself to his work but also remained loyal to his God, staying upright and honest even in a place where many might have given in to temptation. He was, without a doubt, an example of character and dedication, and this did not go unnoticed. His work began to reflect his integrity, and this caused Joseph to gain a position of great trust within Potiphar's house. He was no longer just a slave but someone who had power and responsibility. Potiphar's house became increasingly prosperous, and all of this happened because Joseph was aligned with God's principles, even in such adverse circumstances. It was as if the environment around Joseph was being transformed by his presence. He did not let his condition define him; on the contrary, he used his faith and intelligence to make a difference wherever he was. He became something of an administrator, taking care of Potiphar's goods as if they were his own. Joseph was an example of resilience and perseverance, showing that even in the worst situations, there is always an opportunity to grow and shine. And so, while Joseph remained faithful, his master prospered. But what no one knew was that this story was only beginning, and that Joseph's life, with all its ups and downs, was about to take an even more unexpected turn. Joseph, the son of Jacob, had been sold as a slave in Egypt, but wherever he went, God blessed him. He earned the trust of Potiphar, the official in charge of Pharaoh's guard. Potiphar, noticing that everything Joseph did prospered, made him responsible for his entire household and possessions. Joseph became a man of trust, admired for his dedication and integrity. However, amidst this prosperity, Joseph would soon face a great challenge. Potiphar had a wife, a beautiful and seductive woman, who quickly became interested in Joseph. She saw him every day, and her gaze grew more intense, her gestures more suggestive. Little by little, she began trying to seduce Joseph, asking him to lie with her. However, Joseph was a man of character. He knew that this would be a sin against God and against his master Potiphar, who had entrusted him with everything. The temptation was strong, but he resisted, always telling Potiphar's wife, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" The woman did not give up. She bothered him day after day, making advances and even becoming more brazen in her behavior. Joseph, with wisdom, kept his distance and avoided being alone with her. He knew that the closer he got, the harder it would be to resist. Then, one day, what Joseph had feared happened. Potiphar's wife, with no one else around, grabbed Joseph's cloak and urged him to lie with her. But Joseph didn't hesitate, he ran. He ran so fast that, in the process, he left his cloak in her hands. The woman, furious for being rejected, took the cloak and, in an act of revenge, screamed. She started calling her servants, and with the cloak in her hands, accused Joseph of trying to attack her. When Potiphar came home, his wife, with tears in her eyes, told the false story, that Joseph had tried to lie with her by force, but she screamed, and he fled, leaving his cloak behind. Potiphar, who trusted Joseph but had to listen to his wife, became furious and ordered Joseph to be thrown into prison, without questioning the truth of the accusation. The injustice of it all was clear to Joseph. He knew he had done nothing wrong. Yet, he was taken to prison, a dark and isolated place, where people were often forgotten. But Joseph didn't grow discouraged. Even in that place, God was with him. And as always in his life, the Lord continued to bless him. In prison, Joseph soon gained the trust of the warden and was put in charge of other prisoners. He did not let the circumstances defeat him, and his integrity and wisdom stood out, as they always did. He knew that, despite everything, God was on his side. Even in the most difficult situation, he never stopped trusting in the greater plan God had for his life. Joseph's story teaches us something powerful. Even when we face temptations and injustices, we must maintain our faith and our character, for God has a greater purpose for us, and in his perfect time, he will lift us up. Joseph, the son of Jacob, had been sold as a slave in Egypt, but wherever he went, God blessed him. He earned the trust of Potiphar, the official in charge of Pharaoh's guard. Potiphar, noticing that everything Joseph did prospered, made him responsible for his entire household and possessions. Joseph became a man of trust, admired for his dedication and integrity. However, amidst this prosperity, Joseph would soon face a great challenge. Potiphar had a wife, a beautiful and seductive woman, who quickly became interested in Joseph. She saw him every day, and her gaze grew more intense, her gestures more suggestive. Little by little, she began trying to seduce Joseph, asking him to lie with her. However, Joseph was a man of character. He knew that this would be a sin against God and against his master Potiphar, who had entrusted him with everything. The temptation was strong, but he resisted, always telling Potiphar's wife, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" The woman did not give up. She bothered him day after day, making advances and even becoming more brazen in her behavior. Joseph, with wisdom, kept his distance and avoided being alone with her. He knew that the closer he got, the harder it would be to resist. Then, one day, what Joseph had feared happened. Potiphar's wife, with no one else around, grabbed Joseph's cloak and urged him to lie with her. But Joseph didn't hesitate, he ran. He ran so fast that, in the process, he left his cloak in her hands. The woman, furious for being rejected, took the cloak and, in an act of revenge, screamed. She started calling her servants, and with the cloak in her hands, accused Joseph of trying to attack her. When Potiphar came home, his wife, with tears in her eyes, told the false story, that Joseph had tried to lie with her by force, but she screamed, and he fled, leaving his cloak behind. Potiphar, who trusted Joseph but had to listen to his wife, became furious and ordered Joseph to be thrown into prison, without questioning the truth of the accusation. The injustice of it all was clear to Joseph. He knew he had done nothing wrong. Yet, he was taken to prison, a dark and isolated place, where people were often forgotten. But Joseph didn't grow discouraged. Even in that place, God was with him. And as always in his life, the Lord continued to bless him. In prison, Joseph soon gained the trust of the warden and was put in charge of other prisoners. He did not let the circumstances defeat him, and his integrity and wisdom stood out, as they always did. He knew that, despite everything, God was on his side. Even in the most difficult situation, he never stopped trusting in the greater plan God had for his life. Joseph's story teaches us something powerful. Even when we face temptations and injustices, we must maintain our faith and our character, for God has a greater purpose for us, and in his perfect time, he will lift us up. Joseph, despite being unjustly imprisoned, never allowed despair to take hold of his heart. He knew that his life was in God's hands, and no matter how difficult his situation was, he believed that there was a greater purpose behind everything that happened to him. The prison was dark and suffocating, but Joseph never lost his faith. He continued to be a man of trust, and even in those conditions, his kindness and wisdom did not go unnoticed. One day, two men arrived at the prison. They were servants of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The chief cupbearer and the chief baker had been imprisoned for reasons that Pharaoh no longer wished to discuss. Joseph, always attentive to those around him, quickly noticed that these two men were looking very sad, which was unusual. They were clearly troubled, and Joseph, always willing to help, asked kindly, "Why are you so sad today?" The two servants of Pharaoh, still surprised that a prisoner was so interested in their sorrow, replied that they had both had dreams that night, but they didn't know what they meant. They were lost, without answers to what was happening in their minds. Joseph, who had learned to trust God, knew that his gifts were given for something greater. He believed that the Lord could use this moment to fulfill his plan. So, with an amazing calm, Joseph replied, "The interpretations of dreams belong to God. Tell me your dreams, and God will give us the answer." The chief cupbearer, excited by the possibility of understanding his dream, began to recount what he had seen. He dreamed that he had a vine in front of him, and from the vine, 3 branches grew and blossomed, bearing grapes. He took the grapes and placed them in Pharaoh's cup. It was a simple dream, but Joseph knew there was more to it than just grapes. With wisdom, Joseph interpreted. The 3 branches represent 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will restore your position, and you will again serve him, handing him the cup, just as you did before. But, once restored, please remember me and speak well of me to Pharaoh so that I may be released from this prison. The chief cupbearer was amazed by the clarity and accuracy of the interpretation. But the chief baker, hearing the good news that the cupbearer would be restored, also wanted to tell his dream, thinking that if the other had a good interpretation, his might also be favorable. So, he shared that he had dreamed of 3 baskets of bread on his head, and in the top basket, there was bread for Pharaoh, but birds came and ate it. Joseph looked at the chief baker with a serious expression, and with the same confidence, said, "The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. But, unlike the cupbearer, in 3 days, Pharaoh will take your life. You will be hanged, and the birds will come and eat your flesh." The heart of the chief baker tightened, but Joseph's words were clear and direct. The 2 men, with their dreams revealed, left the prison, and what Joseph had prophesied happened exactly as he said. The chief cupbearer was restored to his position, while the chief baker met a tragic end. Joseph, however, was not remembered by the chief cupbearer, as he had asked. Once free, the cupbearer quickly forgot about Joseph and went on with his life in the palace. The prisoner who had interpreted their dreams so precisely still remained in the dark, waiting for the promised freedom that seemed far away. But Joseph never lost his faith. Even in prison, he knew that God had a plan. He believed that one day something would happen, and his story of suffering would have a greater purpose. Hope, like faith, is something that can withstand the worst storms of life. This story teaches us that even in the most difficult times, when everything seems lost, God has a plan for our lives. Like Joseph, we must keep our faith and trust that, even in the most unexpected situations, God can use us to accomplish great things. And, like him, even without seeing an immediate way out, we must always believe that God is working for our good.
José, a pesar de estar injustamente encarcelado, nunca permitió que la desesperación se apoderara de su corazón. Sabía que su vida estaba en manos de Dios, y no importaba lo difícil que fuera su situación, él creía que había un propósito más grande detrás de todo lo que le sucedía. La prisión era oscura y sofocante, pero José nunca perdió su fe. Continuaba siendo un hombre de confianza, y aun en esas condiciones, su bondad y sabiduría no pasaban desapercibidas. Un día, llegaron dos hombres a la prisión. Eran siervos del faraón, el rey de Egipto. El copero principal y el panadero principal habían sido encarcelados por razones que el faraón ya no quería discutir. José, siempre atento a los demás, pronto se dio cuenta de que esos dos hombres estaban muy tristes, lo cual no era común. Claramente estaban angustiados, y José, siempre dispuesto a ayudar, les preguntó amablemente: ¿por qué están tan tristes hoy? Los dos siervos del faraón, sorprendidos de que un prisionero estuviera tan interesado en su dolor, respondieron que ambos habían tenido sueños esa noche, pero no sabían qué significaban. Estaban perdidos, sin respuestas a lo que ocurría en sus mentes. José, que había aprendido a confiar en Dios, sabía que sus dones habían sido dados para algo más grande. Creía que el Señor podría usar este momento para cumplir su plan. Así que, con una calma impresionante, José respondió: las interpretaciones de los sueños pertenecen a Dios. Cuéntenme sus sueños, y Dios nos dará la respuesta. El copero principal, emocionado por la posibilidad de entender su sueño, comenzó a contar lo que había visto. Soñó que tenía una vid frente a él, y de la vid salían 3 ramas que brotaban y daban uvas. Tomó las uvas y las puso en la copa del faraón. Era un sueño sencillo, pero José sabía que había más que solo uvas. Con sabiduría, José interpretó: las 3 ramas representan 3 días. En 3 días, el faraón restaurará tu posición, y volverás a servirle, entregándole la copa, como lo hacías antes. Pero, una vez restaurado, por favor, acuérdate de mí y habla bien de mí al faraón, para que puedas ser liberado de esta prisión. El copero principal se asombró con la claridad y precisión de la interpretación. Pero el panadero principal, al escuchar las buenas noticias de que el copero sería restaurado, también quiso contar su sueño, pensando que si el otro tenía una buena interpretación, él también la tendría. Entonces, relató que había soñado con 3 canastas de pan sobre su cabeza, y en la canasta superior había pan para el faraón, pero los pájaros venían y lo comían. José miró al panadero principal con una expresión seria, y con la misma confianza, dijo: las 3 canastas también representan 3 días. Pero, a diferencia del copero principal, en 3 días, el faraón te quitará la vida. Serás colgado, y los pájaros vendrán a comer tu carne. El corazón del panadero principal se apretó, pero las palabras de José fueron claras y directas. Los dos hombres, con sus sueños revelados, salieron de la prisión, y lo que José había profetizado sucedió exactamente como él dijo. El copero principal fue restaurado a su puesto, mientras que el panadero principal encontró un final trágico. José, sin embargo, no fue recordado por el copero principal, como había pedido. Una vez libre, el copero rápidamente se olvidó de José y siguió con su vida en el palacio. El prisionero que había interpretado sus sueños con tanta precisión seguía en la oscuridad, esperando la libertad prometida que parecía lejana. Pero José nunca perdió su fe. Aún en la prisión, sabía que Dios tenía un plan. Creía que algún día algo sucedería, y que su historia de sufrimiento tendría un propósito más grande. La esperanza, al igual que la fe, es algo que puede resistir las peores tormentas de la vida. Esta historia nos enseña que incluso en los momentos más difíciles, cuando todo parece perdido, Dios tiene un plan para nuestras vidas. Al igual que José, debemos mantener nuestra fe y confiar en que, incluso en las situaciones más inesperadas, Dios puede usarnos para realizar grandes cosas. Y, como Él, incluso sin ver una salida inmediata, debemos siempre creer que Dios está trabajando para nuestro bien.
Pharaoh of Egypt, the most powerful man in the land, had a restless night, tormented by strange and confusing dreams. He tossed and turned in his bed, unable to understand what those dreams meant. In the first dream, he saw himself standing by the Nile River, the great river that ran through Egypt. Suddenly, 7 healthy and fat cows emerged from the river and began to graze on the bank. But soon after, 7 thin and weak cows appeared, and these thin cows ate the fat cows. Yet, even after swallowing the healthy cows, the thin cows remained weak and sickly, as if nothing had happened. Confused, Pharaoh awoke but soon fell asleep again. This time, he had another dream. 7 healthy and full ears of corn grew on a single stalk. But suddenly, 7 withered and scorched ears appeared, swallowing the healthy ones. Pharaoh woke up, once again perplexed and distressed. He knew these dreams were not ordinary, something was trying to communicate with him, but what did they mean? Worried and restless, Pharaoh called all the wise men, magicians, and astrologers of Egypt to help him understand the dreams. They tried in every way, but they could not find an explanation. Pharaoh grew angry but didn't know whom to turn to. It was at this moment, amid his frustration, that the cupbearer of the king, who had been imprisoned alongside Joseph years earlier, remembered the young Hebrew who had interpreted his own dreams in prison. The cupbearer, regretting having forgotten Joseph for so long, rushed to Pharaoh and said, "O king, many years ago, when I was in prison, there was a young Hebrew named Joseph who interpreted my dreams and those of the other prisoners with remarkable clarity. He said I would return to my position of trust and that the chief baker would be executed, and everything happened exactly as he said." Pharaoh, eager to understand the meaning of his own dreams, immediately summoned Joseph. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh, the king explained the dreams and asked him to interpret them. Joseph, with humility and wisdom, replied, "It is not I who can do this, but God, the Lord of heaven, has the power to reveal what the king desires to know." Joseph then explained the meaning of the dreams. He said that the 7 fat cows represented 7 years of great abundance of food in Egypt, while the thin, weak cows represented 7 years of severe famine that would come right after. The 7 healthy ears of corn represented the 7 years of prosperity, and the 7 withered ears indicated the 7 years of scarcity. Joseph said that, in light of the great crisis that was approaching, Pharaoh should prepare during the years of abundance, storing grain for the coming years of famine. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh was amazed. He could not ignore the power of God that was manifesting through Joseph. And so, Pharaoh, recognizing the discernment of the young Hebrew, appointed him as the second most powerful man in Egypt, in charge of managing the resources during the years of abundance and ensuring that the people would survive the famine. Joseph, who had once been sold as a slave and unjustly imprisoned, was now in a position of honor and authority, showing that, even in the most difficult circumstances, God never abandons those who remain faithful and humble. Pharaoh, in turn, was grateful to have found in Joseph the right man to save Egypt from the destruction that was approaching. This event marked the beginning of a great transformation, not only in Joseph's life but also in the destiny of all of Egypt and the surrounding nations. Pharaoh, with Joseph's help, began to prepare Egypt for what was to come, and everyone eagerly awaited the years of abundance so they could survive the years of scarcity.
José, el hombre que comenzó su viaje de una manera tan difícil y humillante, ahora estaba en una posición de gran poder en Egipto. Había sido elevado al puesto de gobernador, una posición tan alta que nadie en el reino tomaba una decisión sin consultarlo primero. Su camino hasta allí no fue fácil. Pasó por numerosas pruebas, desde ser vendido como esclavo por sus propios hermanos hasta ser encarcelado injustamente. Pero, a lo largo de cada desafío, José permaneció fiel a Dios, lo que lo llevó a ganar la confianza del faraón y la confianza de todo el pueblo egipcio. El faraón, después de haber soñado con vacas gordas y flacas, supo que José, el joven hebreo que tenía el don de interpretar sueños, podía ayudarlo a entender lo que deparaba el futuro. Y eso fue exactamente lo que José hizo. Reveló al faraón que Egipto pasaría por 7 años de abundancia seguidos de 7 años de grave escasez. Impresionado por la sabiduría de José, el faraón decidió confiarle la administración del país para asegurar que Egipto sobreviviera a la futura crisis. José no perdió tiempo. Sabía que la hambruna se avecinaba y que era necesario actuar rápidamente. Durante los 7 años de abundancia, implementó un plan estratégico que parecía audaz, pero era exactamente lo que Egipto necesitaba para sobrevivir. José ordenó la construcción de grandes almacenes en varias ciudades de todo Egipto. En estos depósitos, mandó almacenar trigo y otros granos producidos durante los años de abundancia. La idea era simple, pero brillante. Mientras Egipto vivía un periodo de prosperidad, el gobierno estaba almacenando una porción considerable de la cosecha en almacenes secretos, fuera de la vista de la población. José sabía que la hambruna no llegaría de un día para otro, pero cuando llegara, el pueblo estaría preparado. Estaba salvando a Egipto de una crisis que aún no había llegado, pero él sabía que era inevitable. El pueblo de todo Egipto se sorprendió por la eficiencia del plan. José estaba involucrado en todos los detalles, no solo supervisaba la recolección y almacenamiento de los alimentos, sino que también se aseguraba de que las reservas se gestionaran de manera cuidadosa y ordenada. Todo se hacía con precisión. La confianza del faraón en José creció aún más, ya que veía cómo el joven hebreo estaba manejando la gran responsabilidad que se le había dado. Mientras tanto, las familias egipcias comenzaron a darse cuenta de que algo estaba sucediendo, ya que los almacenes se estaban llenando a un ritmo impresionante. Muchos pensaban que no había razón para tanta preocupación, ya que Egipto estaba en un periodo de gran abundancia. Pero José, con su visión estratégica, sabía que esta era la única manera de enfrentar la futura hambruna. Sabía que, sin el plan de almacenar alimentos, Egipto podría sucumbir a la escasez y miles de vidas se perderían. El pueblo y el faraón, aunque inicialmente escépticos, pronto se dieron cuenta de que José estaba haciendo lo que era necesario para garantizar la supervivencia de todos. Se convirtió no solo en un administrador, sino en un verdadero salvador para Egipto, alguien que había anticipado el futuro y estaba actuando de manera decisiva para proteger a su nación. A medida que los años de abundancia llegaban a su fin y comenzaban los 7 años de hambre, Egipto estaba preparado. Cuando la escasez de alimentos finalmente llegó al país, no fue una crisis inmediata. El pueblo egipcio estaba tranquilo, sabiendo que José se había asegurado de que hubiera comida para todos. Y así, durante los años de hambre, José fue el héroe que garantizó que Egipto no cayera en la miseria. Este plan de José no solo salvó la vida de muchos egipcios, sino que también le valió el respeto y la admiración del faraón y de todo el reino. Se convirtió en el gran administrador que hizo que lo imposible pareciera fácil, un modelo de sabiduría, previsión y coraje en tiempos de incertidumbre. La historia de José nos enseña sobre la importancia de planificar el futuro, actuar con sabiduría y estar preparados para los desafíos que la vida nos presenta. Incluso en las horas más oscuras, la fe en Dios y la sabiduría para tomar las decisiones correctas pueden guiarnos hacia la victoria. José fue un ejemplo de cómo, con determinación, podemos transformar las dificultades en oportunidades para salvar no solo a nosotros mismos, sino también a los que nos rodean.
Joseph, the man who began his journey in such a difficult and humiliating way, was now in a position of great power in Egypt. He had been elevated to the position of governor, a high rank where no one in the kingdom made a decision without consulting Joseph first. His path to this point wasn't easy. He endured numerous trials, from being sold into slavery by his own brothers to being unjustly imprisoned. But with each challenge, Joseph remained faithful to God, which led him to earn the Pharaoh's trust and the trust of all the people of Egypt. The Pharaoh, after having dreams about fat and skinny cows, knew that Joseph, the young Hebrew who had the gift of interpreting dreams, could help him understand what the future held. And that's exactly what Joseph did. He revealed to Pharaoh that Egypt would go through 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh decided to entrust him with the administration of the country to ensure Egypt would survive the coming crisis. Joseph wasted no time. He knew the famine was coming, and that immediate action was necessary. During the 7 years of abundance, he implemented a strategic plan that seemed audacious, but was exactly what Egypt needed to survive. Joseph ordered the construction of large storage facilities in cities all over Egypt. In these storage houses, he had wheat and other grains collected during the years of plenty. The idea was simple but brilliant. While Egypt was living in a period of prosperity, the government was storing a significant portion of the harvest in secret warehouses, out of sight of the people. Joseph knew that famine wouldn't come overnight, but when it did, the people would be prepared. He was saving Egypt from a crisis that hadn't yet arrived, but he knew was inevitable. The people across Egypt were surprised by the efficiency of the plan. Joseph was involved in every detail. He not only supervised the collection and storage of food, but also made sure the reserves were being managed carefully and systematically. Everything was done with precision. Pharaoh's trust in Joseph grew even more as he saw how the young Hebrew was handling the great responsibility given to him. Meanwhile, Egyptian families began to notice that something was happening, as the warehouses were being stocked at an impressive rate. Many thought there was no reason for such concern since Egypt was in a period of great abundance. But Joseph, with his strategic vision, knew that this was the only way to face the coming famine. He knew that without a plan to store food, Egypt could fall into scarcity, and thousands of lives would be lost. The people and Pharaoh, though initially skeptical, soon realized that Joseph was doing what was necessary to ensure the survival of everyone. He became not just an administrator, but a true savior for Egypt, someone who had anticipated the future and was acting decisively to protect his nation. As the years of plenty came to an end and the 7 years of famine began, Egypt was prepared. When the food scarcity finally hit the country, it wasn't an immediate crisis. The Egyptian people were calm, knowing that Joseph had made sure there would be food for all. And so, during the years of famine, Joseph became the hero who ensured Egypt did not fall into misery. This plan of Joseph not only saved the lives of many Egyptians, but it also earned him the respect and admiration of Pharaoh and the entire kingdom. He became the great administrator who made the impossible seem easy, a model of wisdom, foresight, and courage in times of uncertainty. Joseph's story teaches us about the importance of planning for the future, acting with wisdom, and being prepared for the challenges life brings. Even in the darkest hours, faith in God and wisdom in making the right decisions can guide us to victory. Joseph was an example of how, with determination, we can turn difficulties into opportunities to save not only ourselves, but also those around us. The land of Canaan, where Jacob and his sons lived, was struck by a terrible famine. The hot winds from the desert brought with them a difficult year, with no rain and the land parched. Famine began to spread like a heavy cloak, affecting all the cities and villages, even the most distant ones. The fields no longer produced, the animals were thin, and families found themselves increasingly without food. The sound of harvests was no longer heard, and hearts were weighed down by scarcity. Jacob, the father of Joseph and his brothers, saw that the situation was becoming desperate. He knew that if they didn't make a quick decision, his sons and themselves could perish. Then, he heard that there was grain in Egypt, and perhaps it would be possible to buy food. Egypt, ruled by a very powerful man, had abundance because the country had prepared for the famine by storing grain during the years of plenty. Jacob, not knowing what else to do, called his sons and said, "Go to Egypt and buy grain so that we can survive. We don't want to die of hunger here." Joseph's brothers, the sons of Jacob, traveled to Egypt in search of food. They did not know it, but fate was about to take them back to the place they had tried to forget. The long journey led them through arid lands, where the heat and exhaustion made the journey even more difficult. But the need for food pushed them forward, and the hope of finding some relief for their families gave them strength to continue. When they arrived in Egypt, the brothers approached the great city, with its imposing gates and palaces, unaware of what awaited them. As they entered the city, they were about to encounter a face they had forgotten in their hearts, but one that would never fade from their memories. In Egypt, Joseph, who had been sold by his own brothers years earlier, was now the governor of the country, a position of power he had never imagined attaining. He was surrounded by all the wealth of Egypt, with Pharaoh as his leader, and oversaw the granaries that fed the entire land. But, even though he was surrounded by wealth, Joseph never forgot his family, and what he had lived through in the past still tormented him. He knew the moment of reunification with his brothers was near, but he still carried in his heart the pain of betrayal. When the brothers arrived at the palace to buy grain, Joseph saw them from afar. They were tired, with torn clothes and disheartened faces, but what Joseph noticed most was that, among them, was the same face he always remembered. His brothers, those who had sold him as a slave, were standing before him. However, they did not recognize him. The Joseph they knew was a young man who had been sold years earlier, but the powerful man before them, dressed in fine clothes with authority, was unrecognizable. For a moment, Joseph had to control his emotions. He was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of feelings, but he knew he needed to act wisely. He approached his brothers, who were bowing before him, unaware of who he was. They spoke to him, asking for grain for their land, and unknowingly, they were standing before a man who knew everything about their pasts and their choices. Joseph, keeping his identity a secret, asked them questions, and it was then that he saw something in their eyes: regret, a silent pain. He recognized that, despite what they had done, his brothers had changed. They were no longer the arrogant young men who had sold him. Joseph, with his heart stirred, began to make decisions that would lead to the reunification in a way he never imagined. He tested them, asking about their father, and even made some accusations, creating a tense atmosphere. But deep down, he knew the moment of revelation was approaching. He wanted to understand how the brothers had changed, how they felt about what they had done, and if they were worthy of the forgiveness he knew he had to offer. The reunification would be a moment of great emotions, and tears were about to fall, but it was not yet the time. Joseph needed time to reflect, to give himself space to forgive, and to understand that his story did not end there, but that through his pain, he could fulfill a greater purpose, save his family, save Canaan, save himself. The brothers, for their part, did not know what was coming. They were simply trying to survive, but fate had much greater plans for them.
Había una vez, en una tierra lejana, un hombre llamado Jacob, que tenía 12 hijos, cada uno con su propia historia. Pero entre todos ellos, había uno que se destacaba, José. José era el hijo más amado de Jacob, el primogénito de Raquel, la mujer que Jacob amaba profundamente, pero que le fue dada solo después de muchos años de espera y dificultades. Debido a este amor especial, Jacob no escatimó esfuerzos para mostrar su afecto por José. Le dio una túnica colorida, una capa rica y espléndida, un regalo que nadie más tenía. Pero, como siempre ocurre cuando un padre favorece a un hijo, esto causó mucha envidia y resentimiento entre los otros hermanos de José. No entendían por qué Jacob lo trataba de manera diferente, y la envidia crecía en sus corazones día tras día. José, por su parte, no tenía idea de cuánto su posición privilegiada estaba causando tanto sufrimiento a sus hermanos. Era un joven soñador, alguien que veía el mundo con una esperanza inquebrantable y una confianza en el futuro. Pero esos sueños que tenía, sueños que parecían simples, eran más que un reflejo de su mente creativa. Eran proféticos, y esos sueños, cuando los compartió con sus hermanos, solo intensificaron su odio hacia él. Un día, José tuvo un sueño en el que él y sus hermanos estaban en el campo, atando manojos de trigo. De repente, el manojo de José se levantó y se puso de pie, mientras los manojos de sus hermanos se inclinaban hasta que se postraban ante el suyo. Él, sin miedo, les contó a sus hermanos el sueño, y la reacción fue inmediata. Estaban furiosos. ¿Qué estaba diciendo? ¿Que algún día se inclinarían ante él, como si fuera su líder? La envidia se convirtió en ira, y una vez más, José no comprendió la magnitud de lo que estaba ocurriendo a su alrededor. Pero los sueños no se detuvieron allí. José tuvo otro sueño, aún más impresionante, en el que el sol, la luna y 11 estrellas se inclinaban ante él. Compartió este sueño con su familia, incluso con su padre, y la respuesta de su padre fue una mezcla de sorpresa y preocupación. Jacob, aunque tenía dudas sobre el significado del sueño, se preguntaba en su corazón, ¿será que José realmente se convertirá en un gran líder? ¿Y cómo afectará esto a los demás? Pero el corazón de sus hermanos estaba lleno de envidia y dolor, y no podían ver más allá de la competencia, sin comprender que el futuro de José estaba siendo moldeado por algo mucho más grande. La envidia y la ira crecían cada vez más, creando una profunda división en la familia. Comenzaron a planear cómo deshacerse de José. Era una mezcla de frustración y venganza. Los sueños de José, que deberían haber sido señales de esperanza y bendiciones, se convirtieron en símbolos de conflicto y división. Y el joven soñador, aunque inocente en su alegría y confianza, estaba a punto de enfrentar una jornada que cambiaría su vida para siempre. Este fue solo el comienzo de una historia de desafíos, traiciones y, finalmente, redención. Un sueño se convertiría en la clave para la grandeza de José, pero antes de eso, tendría que pasar por pruebas que nadie podría haber imaginado. Pero, como todo gran sueño, él sabía, incluso sin comprenderlo completamente, que lo que estaba por venir era parte de un plan divino que transformaría su vida y el destino de su familia para siempre. Con un corazón puro y lleno de fe, José avanzaba sin saber que aquellos que más lo odiaban serían, de alguna manera, los instrumentos a través de los cuales cumpliría su destino. Y así comienza la jornada de José, el soñador elegido, cuyo brillante futuro no sería fácil, pero que, con perseverancia, demostraría a todos que, a veces, los sueños más imposibles pueden hacerse realidad.